Hey everyone, welcome to Wandering Jews with Mijal and Noam.
I'm Mijal.
And I'm Noam, and this podcast is our way of trying to figure out the Jewish world. We don't have it all figured out, but we're going to try to figure out some big items together. That's what we do on the show.
As we always say, we really love to hear from you, so please email us at wanderingjews@jewishnpack.com and call us at 833-WON-JEWS.
Okay, so today we have a very, very special guest. Amir Tibon is an award-winning journalist. He recently wrote a book called The Gates of Gaza. Amir's a fascinating guy. It was so exciting to have him on this podcast with us because within a week of the 7th of October, the story got out about what he and his family went through. And we talk about it in the podcast itself, but it's just such a remarkably crazy story, right, Michal?
I mean, thinking about Amir really throws me back into those days when, I was just glued to my phone and to Twitter and the news and reading Amir on Twitter, actually, in Hebrew and in English, and the way that he described him and his family in the shelter, the desperation in the kibbutz Nahal Oz, the way that he got his 62-year-old father to come and help rescue them. It was so much a part of how I and so many people learned about the horrors of October 7th, that he and his family really represent both the horrors and the courage of that time.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The courage, when I hear what he went through for 10 hours with his family, it's a form of heroism, what he did and what his father did. And he talks about it. He talks about it in our episode, in our podcast today.
No, we're recording this on October 1st.
Yeah, this is October 1st, 2024. And Nasrallah was killed a few days prior to this. And then Iran, which uses Hezbollah as its proxy, which I don't really like that term because Hezbollah is really more an extension of Iran. And Iran shot missiles indiscriminately into Israel. And his family, Amir's family was in the safe room, the Mamad. Lots of stuff's going on in Israel right now. 8 people were just killed in Jaffa. And it's every single moment. It's hard to keep up with every single thing that's going on. But we had this episode, and hearing from Amir, I think, was so interesting, enlightening, and complicating, right? But I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, no, I want to actually add something. You were just mentioning how we recorded this on a day when, crazy things are happening pretty much every day in the Middle East and in Israel. And I'll just say, we are commemorating October 7th, a year after October 7th, the greatest massacre of Jews after the Holocaust. I know for me, there's a lot of questions about what it means to remember, what it means to honor, what it means to mourn, what it means to move forward. And I'll just name that one of the things that is hard, and I think it's actually important to name it, is that it's not like it was a story that happened and then it was over. And now it's a year afterwards and we have to think, how do we remember? Like Amir still has friends who are hostages.
Yep.
Right? Amir and his family and community are still evacuated. Amir left his community in the south, while now the north is under attack and the whole of Israel is under attack. So there's something about the nature of Jewish history and memory at this moment in which we are tasked with the project of remembering and mourning, even as things are continuing to happen and our emotions continue to be up and down. So I was grateful that Amir came. I think it's very hard to be a storyteller for the bereaved and the wounded, and a storyteller that also, I was actually surprised, Noam, by the way that he kept, I thought he actually sounded hopeful in the way that he kept talking about, we're going back, we're rebuilding this and that. And it takes also a certain kind of resilience to be able to be a storyteller for what was, but also insist in talking about the future. So that's also just some thoughts for us to sit with as we prepare to mark October 7th in different ways in different communities around the world.
So everyone take a listen.
And after the listen, we're going to just talk a little bit more about what he shared with us.
We thought a lot about who to speak to for our episode on the 1-year anniversary of 10/7, or as it's called in Israel, 7/10, the 7th of October. And we are so lucky to be speaking to and with Amir Tibon.
Hi, guys. Great to be here.
Amir, great to be here with you. I'll just say, Amir, that I follow you on Twitter, and I feel like I have been, living through October 7th and aftermath, a lot of it reading what you've written. Amir Tibon is an award-winning Israeli journalist and the author of a recently published book called The Gates of Gaza. It's really very recently published. It's been a few days. And Amir, you've emerged as one of the storytellers who are telling the story of what happened in Israel on October 7th. So we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you guys so much.
I want to dive directly in, Amir. There's so much to talk about over here. Before we get to the 7th of October, before we get to that day, I want you to tell us a little bit about yourself, about your life growing up, how you ended up in Nahal Oz. Just very briefly, paint us a picture.
So I grew up in northern Israel, actually. I grew up in a military family. My father served for most of my childhood and teenage years in the Israeli military. And so we were wandering around. Maybe this is, something that is connected to the title of your podcast, but we were wandering around like many military families do, from one post to another. And a lot of it was in the north. My father was in Lebanon. So I grew up right on the Lebanese border, in a place not as close to Lebanon as Nahal Oz, my future home, is to Gaza, but also not very far from that standard. Like within the line of Hezbollah's rocket fire, all of my childhood, we had incidents like the one I had this evening before talking to you, because we're recording this on a day that Iran fired missiles at Israel, and I had to run with my two young daughters to the safe room. So I grew up with that kind of thing, actually. Later, I lived in Tel Aviv. I'm a journalist. I write for Haaretz. And I moved to kibbutz Nahal Oz, which is the closest community in Israel to Gaza, in 2014, following that year's Israel-Hamas war. It's a long story, and I write about it in my book, The Gates of Gaza, which was just published by Little Brown and Company in the US. Very briefly, during that summer, Nahal Oz was bombarded heavily by Hamas and suffered a terrible tragedy with the death of a 4-year-old child in the community. Daniel Tregerman was his name. After that happened, a lot of families left the community. And then other people from other parts of Israel, including my wife and I, decided to move there. We were young at the time. We were living in Tel Aviv. And we just made a decision, a combination of Zionist ideals, adventurism, and a search for community and belonging and a mission to be a part of, that we are moving to Nahal Oz. And we did. And we ended up getting married there, raising our 2 daughters there, becoming part of this amazing kibbutz, a great community. And we were there on October 7th. That's, if I had to summarize it in a minute and a half, that would be my summary.
Amir, before we get to October 7th, you said that you had like Zionist values and adventure that drew you to Nahal Oz. So what did it symbolize for you? Why did you and your wife decide to move there after such a tragedy?
We believe in the founding principles of Zionism, which is that there needs to be a Jewish democratic state of Israel. And we believe that in order for this country to continue existing and thriving, we should not only think about existence. Survival is very important, but we also need to thrive and grow as a country. And in order for all that to happen, we need to have secure borders. Israel is surrounded by enemies of all sorts that would like our country to disappear. And the communities alongside Israel's borders, communities like those in the north that have been evacuated since October 8 because of Hezbollah's attacks, and like those along the border with Gaza that were infiltrated and attacked on October 7, are the front lines of this idea. We need to protect the borders of this country. It's not a coincidence that the first governments of the State of Israel, led by David Ben-Gurion, invested a lot of resources in these border communities like Nahal Oz. For example, Nahal Oz was founded in 1953 as a direct order from Moshe Dayan, who was at the time the most influential general in Israel, based on this idea that there needs to be civilian communities along the borders, that it's not enough for Israel to have military presence on its borders because militaries can easily be redeployed and structured back. You need to have communities there that will hold these borders and that will send a message to the people on the other side that Israel is here to stay. Israel is not some temporary military presence like the American military in Vietnam, for example. Israel is a country where people live and raise their children and have communities and work the land. And once you believe in those ideals, you see the importance of stopping a community like Nahal Oz from falling apart in the aftermath of tragedy, which is something that almost happened in 2014. And I just want to say that as a citizen of Israel, if I look back for a moment and take kind of like a 10,000 feet view, what really happened on October 7 and its aftermath is that all of these border communities like Nahal Oz and like Kiryat Shmona in the north, all of these places that Israel built for decades and invested in and put a lot of effort to make them grow, and people literally put their blood and sweat and tears and dreams into those places, all of those places were then abandoned and some of them destroyed on October 7. And we will have to rebuild them with the same efforts and resources that were invested in them for dozens of years before. This is a major issue that we've not even started discussing as a society because we're so busy with the day-to-day. You know, I'm recording with you on a day when 8 people were murdered in a terror attack in Tel Aviv, and then Iran fired 100 ballistic missiles all over the country. So how can we even talk about these big ideals? But in the big picture, this is what happened on October 7.
So could you tell us, I know it's a long and intense story, but could you tell us a little bit about how you and your family, your 2 children, October 7th, what it was like for you individually?
Without reliving it too much, because it's a treacherous story that when I read through it, you were a journalist I'd followed for a long time, and then just hearing that story of what you went through made it so real for me, so human for me.
Yeah.
And not that like 1,200 Israelis being murdered and 251 being taken hostage. That was real for me also.
But a story sometimes
but the story
easier.
was,
yeah, of course. Yeah, I want
Amir,
to
even when you said earlier that you and your daughters were in a mamad today, like my heart said, like, thank you. Great. You know what I mean? Like knowing what you went through, like you really personalized this for us.
So I'll tell you something, Noam and Mijal, I really, really agree that a story is stronger than a message. And we are always, as Israelis, busy with messaging and hasbara and do we say the right things? But once you're explaining, and hasbara literally is to explain, you are already losing. You're on the defensive side. And a story always beats a message. Not that messaging is not important, but a story explains the message better than the message itself. And that's why, by the way, I wrote the book telling the story of my family and my community on that day. Because I believe in the power of a story more than anything else, and that all the explanations in the world cannot compete with one story about one family. And in my case, I wrote about many families in the kibbutz, but if you want to kind of really, really get it to the most filtered level, the story of my 2 daughters who woke up that morning when gunfire is being fired into our house, and they were in a small room, what we call the safe room, the mamad, this little in-house shelter. And it was dark because there was no electricity. There was no food. We couldn't turn on any lights. We heard the bullets exploding inside our living room. And then we had to tell these 2 girls, my oldest was 3.5 years old at the time, and my youngest wasn't even 2 years old, that they have to be quiet. I mean, think about children those ages waking up from a scary sound in the dark, and their best and most correct instinct would be to start crying. And then on top of all that, being told you cannot cry. And we were like that for 10 hours almost, until the first military force arrived in our neighborhood to start rescuing families. And in the book, I tell how my father, who is 62 years old and lives in Tel Aviv, and has been retired from the military for almost a decade, joined that military force and also arrived to our house. And then I tell about also the next hours after, this happened and we were finally able to leave the safe room. Our home became somewhat of a refuge for neighbors from other homes around us, and they all gathered in our house. And that's when we started to learn what happened to other people in our community. A neighbor in the house in front of us was killed while engaging the terrorists, trying to fight them. And another neighbor in the house behind us was murdered because the terrorists had succeeded to break into our house. Overall, in my community in Nahal Oz, 15 people were murdered on that day out of a community of 450 people.
Wow.
Imagine that in your neighborhood or in your town, within one day, 3% of the population was murdered. Because that's what happened to us. 15 people out of 450 approximately, we lost in one day 3% of our population. Just try to internalize that for a second. Imagine it in your neighborhood, in your small town, where you grew up, in your school, God forbid. And then on top of that, we had 7 friends who were kidnapped into Gaza. 5 were released in November, thanks to the deal orchestrated by President Biden, for which we will always be grateful, because that deal brought us back alive. 5 women and girls from our kibbutz. The oldest, 84 years old, she arrived basically on the verge of death from the tunnels of Gaza. And if the deal had been delayed by 24 hours, she would have died. But she's alive today, thanks to that deal in November. And the youngest, an 8-year-old girl, who was kidnapped together with her 15-year-old sister, Dafna and Ella. They became quite famous in the beginning of the war. I was giving a lot of interviews talking about the urgent need to bring them back. And as we record tonight, we still have 2 friends, 2 neighbors in the hands of Hamas, Omri Miran and Tzachi Idan, both of them fathers of young children. And we continue to fight for their release. And I want to share that this morning, before everything that happened today, the terror in Tel Aviv and the rockets from Iran, everything. This morning at 6:30 a.m., I received a message from a relative of Omri, one of my 2 friends who was kidnapped in Gaza. And she wrote to me that she wants to thank me for continuing to speak about him, because they are being forgotten. And I just didn't even know what to say about that. So that's the story in a nutshell. There's many, many more details in the book, but that's kind of like the big picture.
Well, I mean, I'm just sitting, it's every time you see the human connection to the stories or statistics, it just lands really differently. And you're reminding us how important it is to not forget the human dimension of it all. I know you said that stories are stronger than messages. But I'm sure you wrote the book, The Gates of Gaza, because you wanted to convey certain messages, both to Israeli society, I imagine to Jews around the world. Can you tell us a little bit like why you wrote the book? What were the messages that you hope to convey?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So first of all, I really wanted to tell the story. That was my number one goal. I started writing it at the end of November. I wrote it in English, because my intention was to tell it to an international audience. Later, I also translated it myself into Hebrew. But the first mission I took upon myself was to write the story in English. And I wrote it in a way that is different than other books, some of them excellent books that I recommend, but still different than other books about October 7, in that the book does not only happen on October 7. It basically has 2 timelines that run in parallel to one another. There's the October 7 timeline in kibbutz Nahal Oz, which begins at 6:30 a.m. when a barrage of mortars falls on our neighborhood and we have to run to the safe room. And then there is the historical timeline of Nahal Oz, which I tell separately, and it begins in 1953 when the kibbutz was founded by a group of 60 young men and women on a mission from Moshe Dayan to build this new border community. And so there's, October 7 chapter, history chapter, October 7 chapter, history chapter, until the 2 timelines meet toward the end of the book when history arrives at October 6. And the way I did it, and this connects to your question about messages, Mijal, because if there was one message I wanted to convey, is that all of these places that were attacked on October 7, Nahal Oz, Sderot, Ofakim, Be'eri, were not born on October 7. And I fear that October 7 will become the only thing to be affiliated with them in the historical outlook, that 50 years from today, the only thing that somehow will be affiliated with these communities is October 7. And I didn't want that, because all of these places, which I believe will be rebuilt and expanded in the future, but even just looking from a point of suppose history stopped on October 7, all of these places had a very rich history, fascinating history that tells us a lot about the history of Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so that's why I added these historical chapters that they tell the history of the kibbutz, and through it, the history of Israel and Gaza and the relationship between our country and this territory, entity, enclave right next to us. And I thought it was important to give that context so that we understand October 7 is part of a longer history of a relationship that had a lot of ups and downs, by the way. I mean, I tell in the book about previous acts of terrorism that happened as early as the 1950s in my kibbutz. And I also tell about Palestinians from Gaza who attended weddings in Nahal Oz and people from Nahal Oz who went to the beaches of Gaza on Saturday morning on bicycles, and things that today sound imaginary, but they are also part of this history.
I love that. One of the things, first of all, Amir, I love your father's name. He's got a great name.
Well, I tend to agree, definitely.
I think he's got a great first
name. And
my
most beloved cousin is Mijal, so you
guys
are cool. You guys are cool.
We're in good company. That makes me happy. Amir, one of the things that I've really enjoyed to do, this is what I like to do as a educator, podcaster. I like to complicate narratives for people. I really like to do that. So when I started following you and then reading what you spoke about, the message that I think that you share is actually complicating the narrative a little bit. Meaning it doesn't seem to me to be the case that you present a hasbara, one side or the other. It doesn't seem to me to be the case that the way you talk about Israel is every American Jew, every Australian Jew, every British Jew or non-Jew. We want you to stand with all of Israeli policies. And on the other hand, you're very clear against the problems of terrorism. What is your message to the English-speaking Jewish world about, and maybe beyond the Jewish world, about Israel? Because there is, for many of us, there is a very strong defensive posture that we feel right now to defend every single thing, every single move, every single movement. Because if we don't, I'll tell you what happens. What happens is it feels like everyone else is attacking Israel. So we go into Anachnu tzrichim lasbir. We go into I have to explain, and we do go into hasbara mode. But why? It doesn't seem like that's what you do.
So why? I don't believe personally in this concept of, let's say, hasbara. I think again telling a story from my perspective is the more important thing. And I do have to say that I also don't share the outlook that everybody is against Israel, because at least in the United States, Israel is a very popular country. And listen, I mean, we've been in this war for a year now, and Israel has been getting from the United States basically almost a free hand. There is nothing that Israel wanted to do that it did not eventually do. There was a moment around April, May, when there was an argument about going into Rafah, and that was resolved with Israel going into Rafah, taking over Philadelphia, and it's still controlling it right now. So that's kind of like the framework. Now I understand there's anti-Semitism. I don't deny it. I've experienced it myself. Israel has big problems with younger populations all over the world and also in the United States. The long-term trajectory of American support for Israel is far from guaranteed. And I don't, underestimate the risks that we are facing. But at the same time, I also think it's important to remember the good things. Okay, we were all expecting around the DNC in Chicago a few months ago a total, shutdown of the conference with tens of thousands of anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli and pro-Hamas demonstrators. And instead, the most memorable moment of that Democratic convention was the speech by the two people I admire most in the entire country right now, John and Rachel Goldberg-Polin, who spoke about the need to make a deal to bring back the hostages and received a standing ovation that maybe Michelle Obama got more applause than they did. Maybe, okay? Now, in terms of my criticism of the Israeli government, this specific government, I believe that this government failed the most principal commitment of any government to its citizens, which is to protect the people. And on top of that, it then failed to take responsibility for what happened. Our community has been evacuated to the small kibbutz outside Haifa. It's called Mishmar HaEmek. We've been here since October 8th, when the first buses brought our community over here from Nahal Oz. And we emerged like ghosts, after everything we've been through. During this entire year, not a single minister from the Netanyahu government bothered to come here and visit us. Some of them inquired if they could come and meet only a small group of selected residents so that they don't have to face up to the anger and the pain. And of course, we refuse that, because if you're a minister in the government, you want to come here and then put up a photo on your Facebook and your Instagram. Oh, I met with the heroes of Nahal Oz. You should be able to stand and hear my neighbor Gali, whose daughter, 18-year-old Mayan, was murdered on that day. And then her husband Tzachi was kidnapped into Gaza. And he's still there in the tunnels of Gaza. And if you want to come here, you need to meet my neighbor, who is now actually in reserve service in the north of Israel, Avishai, who has 4 young children. and for the entire year 2023 was demonstrating against the judicial reform of the government and warning that they are leading us to disaster. And then his family was almost murdered, and since October 8, he's been in reserve service Miluim. We had other people come and visit us here. Naftali Bennett, the previous prime minister, he was here on October 15, a week after we arrived. He came here, no fanfare, no cameras. He came to the Shiva of one of my neighbors who was murdered, and he said, even though he hasn't been in office for a year and a half, on October 7, he said, I want to apologize on behalf of the state of Israel, which was very powerful. And he said, everything will have to be investigated, all the failures, including things that happened under my watch as prime minister. To me, that's leadership, and it's lacking right now in this country. And I say it, and I believe the last thing I want to say, Israel is the insurance policy of every Jew in the world. Today, there are places in the world which are not safe for Jews, and there are places where there is a risk that in the future they will not be safe for Jews. Israel is the insurance policy of every Jew in America and in France and in the UK. And that's why Jews in the diaspora need to make sure that Israel remains a strong, prosperous, and democratic society, one that can actually be a shelter and a plan B for their children and grandchildren. If Israel becomes poor, weak, undemocratic, extreme, illiberal, you will lose your insurance plan. And that's why everybody has to really care about what's happening here in Israel and not just say, I support the IDF and I don't involve myself in the internal questions of the country. So that's kind of like my spiel in a few words.
Well, Amir, I hear in your words an invitation to become more fully stakeholders.
Yes,
and to not sit in the sidelines and to really give everything we have to the project that you and so many others have helped build and defend. You spoke before about both thinking about the tragedy that happened in the past, and also you spoke about the kibbutz being rebuilt. I'm just curious, as we wind down our conversation, American Jews, we are, the experience of being a Jew in the world is uneven right now. We are experiencing different challenges and different things in different places. And many of us are trying to figure out how to walk into this day, how to mourn, how to honor, how to also have hope at the same time. And I'm just wondering if you have any words about what you and other Israelis, how, from where you're sitting, what do you hope guides us as American Jews are commemorating October 7th?
First of all, the American Jewish community has been there for us big time since October 7, and also other diaspora communities. But we have received so much help from North America. It's astounding, really. I mean, I mentioned earlier the government ministers not showing up. I cannot count how many delegations from North America have showed up, have come to visit us, have come to hear our stories and see with their eyes what happened. And financial support has been overwhelming and incredible. And we still need more, to be honest, because there are two challenges these communities face. One is rebuilding and the other is improving. We don't just want to go back to October 6th. We want to build better communities, better places so that more people will join and these places will grow and expand. And in order to achieve that, we will need a lot of help from the American Jewish community. The American Jewish community can be our best messenger in telling the story, not in spreading messages in hasbara, not in writing viral tweets, all of those things, whatever. If you're into that, have fun. Tell the story. And our brothers and sisters in America, they can be our best allies in doing that. Telling the story, not allowing all the people who deny, minimize, justify or whitewash what happened on October 7 to erase the story. To keep telling it as it is.
Beautiful. Well, thank you.
Well, that's something that we're very much so committed to telling the story. And Amir, thank you so much for joining us in this incredibly, incredibly crazy day.
Yeah, crazy indeed. I hope that by the time this is live, we'll have a little more quiet here and that we'll have a Shana Tova.
Amen.
And the start of this Shana Tova is a deal to bring back our hostages.
Amen.
Alive.
May they all come home soon.
Toda
Thank you, Amir.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, Amir.
Bye-bye.
That was a lot. One of the things that he said I wrote down as he said it, he said, a story is stronger than a message.
Yeah. I wrote it down also.
You wrote it down? Okay. I just think it's So true.
Noam, you know what I'm sitting with? You can hear in Amir so many different voices that actually I think represent the kibbutzim that were hit so hard on October 7th. These were kibbutzim filled with like old style, like Zionist ideology, center left, that old kind of like kibbutz image that many of us have. And I heard with him so many different voices and stories, just the horror of what happened, the feeling of being not only attacked by external enemies, but betrayed, right, by your government. And also determination to say, we're not giving up. We are fighting in multiple fronts, both in terms of telling the stories, in terms of defending, right? He spoke a lot about the importance to have communities around the border. And also for him, part of the story of October 7th, that I just want to acknowledge that sometimes in the States, it's hard for us to understand this in the way that Israelis think about this. But for him, part of the story of October 7th is about leadership and who's at the helm of Israel and who he and so many others wish, what the kind of leadership they wish they had. So that's a lot of what I was hearing in his words.
Absolutely. Same with me. I think for me, it was this throwback early Zionist of the 1950s that I was imagining, like an early secular Zionist that maybe I don't spend enough time with people like that. And
you
and
should,
I think
Noam.
I should. I'd like to.
Yeah.
I'd like to, because a lot of people make the argument that Zionism is moving away from that old liberal, national liberal perspective. But Amir really speaks to that. I want to do something. The Gates of Gaza is named for another early throwback secular Zionist from a eulogy that was delivered by Moshe Dayan, who is in the annals of Israeli history a significant leader, significant military leader, fascinating parts of his history, some salty parts of his history. But he delivers a really beautiful eulogy. And I did something funny. It's very funny, I think. I asked ChatGPT what you think the message of this is. Okay, I'm going to say it in English. Here it is. So it's a eulogy that was delivered for Roy Rothberg in 1956.
And this was like a young man who was part of the security forces.
Yeah, a young guy, 21 years old. And this is his eulogy. It's short. Yesterday with daybreak, Roy was murdered. The quiet of a spring morning blinded him, and he did not see the stalkers of his soul on the furrow. Let us not hurl blame at the murderers. Why should we complain of their hatred for us? 8 years have they sat in the refugee camps of Gaza and seen with their own eyes how we have made a homeland of the soil and the villages where they and their forebears once dwelt. Not from the Arabs of Gaza must we demand the blood of Roe, but from ourselves. How our eyes are closed to the reality of our fate, unwilling to see the destiny of our generation in its full cruelty. Have we forgotten that this small band of youth settled in Nahal Oz carries on its shoulders the heavy gates of Gaza, beyond which hundreds of thousands of eyes and arms huddle together and pray for the onset of our weakness so that they may tear us to pieces? Has this been forgotten? For we know that if the hope of our destruction is to perish, we must be morning and evening, armed and ready. A generation of settlement are we, and without the steel helmet and the maw of the cannon, we shall not plant a tree nor build a house. Our children shall not have lives to live if we do not dig shelters, and without the barbed wire fence and the machine gun, we shall not pave a path nor drill for water. The millions of Jews annihilated without a land peer out at us from the ashes of Israeli history and command us to settle and rebuild a land for our people. But beyond the furrow that marks the border lies a surging sea of hatred and vengeance, yearning for the day that the tranquility blunts our alertness, for the day that we heed the ambassadors of conspiring hypocrisy who call for us to lay down our arms. It is to us that the blood of Roe calls from his shredded body. Although we have vowed 1,000 vows that our blood will never again be shed in vain, yesterday we were once again seduced, brought to listen, to believe. Our reckoning with ourselves we shall make today. We mustn't flinch from the hatred that accompanies and fills the lives of hundreds of thousands of Arabs who live around us and are waiting for the moment when their hands may claim our blood. We mustn't avert our eyes, lest our hands be weakened. That is the decree of our generation. That is the choice of our lives. To be willing and armed, strong and unyielding, lest the sword be knocked from our fists and our lives severed. Roy Rothberg, the thin blonde lad who left Tel Aviv in order to build his home alongside the gates of Gaza to serve as our wall. Roi, the light in his heart blinded his eyes, and he saw not the flash of the blade. The longing for peace deafened his ears, and he heard not the sound of the coiled murderers. The gates of Gaza were too heavy for his shoulders, and they crushed him.
Wow. That's really intense, Noam.
Mijal, before going to ChatGPT, what's your take? What's the message?
I think Dayan is giving this almost like collectivist existential message to Jews. And don't forget, this is like soon after the Shoah, right after the establishment of the State of Israel. And I think he's basically saying, like, yes, they're going to hate us. And there's reasons for that. And it's almost like we shouldn't even focus on blaming those enemies for those reasons. But we should just, above everything else, watch out against complacency. And don't we dare lay down our arms, and don't we dare become defenseless again. It's almost like he's saying we finally have power and agency. So the danger that we have now is this like naivete or this illusion that we should lay down our guns and our swords. And there's something I think very haunting because it's describing a certain, our friend Chaviv Artigur often says, it's what it means to be a Jew. You got to fight, right? So it's like what it means to be an Israeli. You got to fight. There's no alternative. And if you fool yourself into thinking there is one, then you will suffer and you will have to blame yourself. Which, a lot of that, by the way, is like in the words that Amir was sharing. I hear that. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
It's radical. It's radical in two ways. It's radical because it's saying, Jews, defend yourselves. You have to defend yourselves. That's what it means to be a Zionist. That's what it means to be a Jew. It's you who has to defend yourself. You have to do this. Second sentence, the Palestinians, the Arabs have a reason to hate us. And let's acknowledge that. And that both things are true simultaneously. That is something that leads to a lot of cognitive dissonance for a lot of us. Like it's just tough. It's because what we do is, well, if I'm here to defend myself, then they shouldn't want to hurt us. They shouldn't want to. And what Dayan seems to be saying is stop focusing on what they should or shouldn't want. Actually, if you're them and you see what we're doing, what we're building up, would you not also have that in you a little bit? But that doesn't mean that you don't have to defend yourself. He doesn't give that easy way out either. You still have to defend yourself. You still have to sacrifice. That's the radical part of this.
I know you're saying it's radical, but we spoke before, it's October 1st. There's hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are standing up right now with weapons, willing to risk their lives, because I think that I think it's radical for us in America.
I actually think that's a great point. I think you're spot on.
It's like we live in such a comfortable place where most of when we speak about being in danger, it's mostly words. There's, of course, incidents of physical danger, but there are few in between, thank God. In Israel, it's not radical because people, since October 7th and every day since, people live in their flesh the reality that they have to live by the sword, even if you don't want to. But if you fool yourself into thinking that's not true, then your children will suffer and there'll be tragedy. So it's tragic, but it's almost like it's better to look at this in the eye and confront this and then fight than to fool yourself into complacency. All right, Noam. So let's finish with the machines. So what did ChatGPT say? Oh,
ChatGPT. Back to our friend. So this is what my best friend told me. She said,
ouch.
He said, the main point of the eulogy is to emphasize the tragic inevitability of the conflict and the responsibility the Jewish people bear in reclaiming and defending their homeland, while also acknowledging the deep pain and bitterness on both sides. Dayan speaks of the tension between Israelis' need for security and the Palestinians' resistance to losing their land, saying that the Arabs view the Jews as invaders and thus there will continue to be bloodshed. He calls for a stoic acceptance of the reality that Israel must continue to defend itself. His eulogy is both a tribute to Roy Rothberg's sacrifice and a somber reminder that the survival of Israel is inextricably linked with violence and sacrifice. In essence, the speech highlights the dual themes of mourning and a resolve to continue building the nation despite the cost of life.
That's pretty good. Stoic, inevitability. That's very good.
There you go. Artificial intelligence for you.
Noam, before we leave, it was really important for us to hear from Amir and about his newly released book, The Gates of Gaza. But I'll tell you, for me, when I think about this anniversary, right, this time commemorating October 7th, I also think we need to make space for something more emotional. something that has to do with mourning, with letting ourselves, have like a little bit of the outbreak, have a little bit of the outpouring of the heartbreak that so many of us are feeling. I know, I'll share with you now about another book that came out recently. It's the English version of a book that I know you read in Hebrew called One Day in October, 40 Heroes, 40 Stories by Yair Agmon and Oriya Mevorach. And, I was nervous to read the book. It's firsthand testimonials, 40 stories of what happened on October 7th. And then when I opened it, I read the whole thing in one sitting. And honestly, it felt like a punch to the gut. Is that the right expression, Noam?
Yeah,
just
100%.
Like a punch to the gut. It just brought me back to the horror, the stories of mothers with babies in the kibbutzim and young men and women deciding to risk their lives, and citizens picking up a gun and a car and driving to the south and witnessing nightmares and trying to save people, and fathers trying to save their children, and just so much devastation. The book insists also on showcasing the courage, the resilience, the beauty, I would say, of so many. And I'm just sitting with that, No, I'm just with what it means to contain so much heartbreak and to allow ourselves to mourn and not to become numb. Because I think for me, sometimes there's so much pain and so much mourning and also so much news that are happening constantly that numbness sets in. So October 7th, really important to pause. And I'm going into it with a lot of like heaviness, a lot of knowing that we're still processing it and that we didn't finish the story that we're still living in. Fear for the hostages, knowing that we can't have a happy ending without them back home. And just questions about what it means to live in America and to remember what our brothers and sisters went through and are still going through in many ways.
I've been thinking a lot about the messages of the 7th of October. And you said like that you're not sure there's going to be, we don't yet have a happy ending until the hostages are returned. It's still, October 7th feels like it's still happening. Just see images right now where you and I are recording of Israelis and Jewish people just cowering with missiles flying over them. I struggle with understanding what it means to have a happy ending. What is it? What does it mean for the story to conclude in a happy way?
I was listening to a different podcast interview. I do listen to other podcasts occasionally with a good friend, Yossi Kainelevi, and he was reflecting on seeing bumper stickers around Jerusalem saying, "L'sipur shelanu yet sof tov." Our story will have a happy ending, a sort of commitment to that. But maybe, Noam, without pretending to answer the question, I want to read one poem that actually came to mind as Amir was speaking, because I found a lot of hope when Amir was describing being enveloped by love and support from Jews around the world. And that to me has been, that and the heroism of so many Israelis to me has been the silver lining of this time and my source of hope and resilience. So I'm going to read this poem called Kutonet Pasim by Racheli Moshkovitz. Kutonet Pasim in English means a coat of many colors, which is in reference to the multicolored garment that Joseph in Genesis wore. And I'll read it in Hebrew and English. בני חזר מהמערכה ותרמילו מתפקע מכל מה שלא אני ארזתי לו. My son returned from battle, his duffel bursting with things that I had not packed for him. גרביים שתרמה קהילה מארגנטינה, שמיכה משובצת בריח בית אחר. Socks donated by Jews in Argentina, a quilted blanket smelling like someone else's home. מגבת כחולה ממשפחה מהמושב, ציצית מירושלים, a blue towel from a family from the מושב, ציצית from Jerusalem, fleas מתנת חברת הייטק, צעיף שסרגה קשישה, גופיות שנקנו מקבוצת פייסבוק, סדין שנתן לו חבר, כפפות שקנו נערות, a fleece jacket gifted by a high-tech company, a scarf knitted by an elderly lady, undershirts purchased by online shoppers, a sheet that was given to him by a friend, gloves bought by teenage girls, מעיל מהארון של מישהו שבא וביקש לתת, a jacket from the closet of somebody who came and just wanted to give. פורסת את כל האריגים. I spread out all those garments. ורוקמת כותונת פסים חדשה. and I weave together a new coat of many colors. Re'eh Yosef, see Joseph, arvu lecha achecha. Your brothers were there for you. So this poem, Noam, is a reference to the story of Joseph when his brothers actually sold him, to others. And here it's the opposite. It's a mother looking at her son, who himself is risking his life for other Jews, and saying, look, you are surrounded by all of these donations from people and Jews all around the world. And in many ways, it's a repair, a tikkun of that ancient Joseph story, in which not only did we not betray, but we actually did the opposite of that, and were there in extraordinary ways. So hearing that from Amir and just thinking about this day and all of its heaviness and the anguish and the pain, to me, it's both about mourning, but also about having a renewed commitment to be there for each other and to continue asking ourselves, how do we just show up and give our people the ability to write more of these kinds of poems.
Beautiful. Stunning.
We have listeners from around the world, Noam, and it's always meaningful to me to think that there is this like invisible network of people who are, in conversation with us, and we are in conversations with Jews around the world, with Amir's story, with Racheli Moshkovich. We're in conversation with all the people that she describes donating to her son. And I just hope that we take our pain and all of us continue to just build stronger connections.
Amen. Thank you.
Wandering Jews is a production of Unpacked, a division of OpenDor Media. Subscribe to Wandering Jews wherever you're listening to this pod, and follow Unpacked at all the social media places. Just look for @JewishUnpacked. And most of all, be in touch. Write to us at wonderingjews@jewishunpacked.com. This episode was hosted by Mijal Bitton and Noam Weissman. This show is researched by Hona Dodge. Audio is edited by me, Rob Pera, and we're produced by Rivki Stern.